Tonight, Donald Trump is going to be giving a primetime address on the situation at the border, and it is going to be filled with lies. And we know this for a few reasons. One, because he is a liar. He's a vicious, constant liar, but also because his administration has been just constantly lying about the situation down there, going back to the beginning of the administration. But especially the past couple of weeks, it has just been every day, and it really doesn't matter how many times you correct them or provide accurate information, they adapt slightly. It's like fighting the Borg. But we're gonna do what we can to get out in front of his attempt to change the narrative later on today. But first, I wanna show you some examples of the sorts of lies that are likely to be included in his speech tonight. First, in this video being spread by Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
The president talks about terrorists potentially coming across the border. And here is Secretary of Homeland Security Nielsen. Take a look.
CBP has stopped over 3,000 what we call special interest aliens trying to come into the country on the southern border. Those are aliens who the intel community has identified are of concern.
But special interest aliens are just people who come from countries that have ever produced a terrorist. They're not terrorists themselves, and the State Department says that there is, quote, their words, no credible evidence of any terrorists coming across the border from Mexico.
We know that roughly nearly 4,000 known or suspected terrorists come into our country illegally. And we know that our most vulnerable point of entry is at our southern border.
I know this statistic. I didn't know if you were going to use it, but I studied up on this. Do you know where those 4,000 people come, or where they're captured? Airports.
Not always, but certainly a large number.
The State Department says there hasn't been any terrorists that they found coming across the southern border from Mexico.
It's by air, it's by land, and it's by sea. It's all of the above.
Yeah, but it's mostly not by land. That's what he was pointing out. So look, Chris Wallace, I guess at the risk of losing his audience there, corrected her.
Yeah.
And he did a good job.
He did do a good job. We gave him credit for that because it shows that even though he's a conservative, that's fine. If you disagree philosophically or politically, that's okay, as long as you're actually honest about the facts. That's what matters the most.
Exactly, and what's interesting is that I remember over the weekends, I was trying not to pay too much attention to politics, but I saw it keep coming up that he had done a very good job of repeatedly grilling her on that. And you would think that if he puts Fox News in that position where he has already laid out that she is lying, or at the very least, woefully misinformed, well, I guess on Fox and Friends, we got to go with that. But no, they just ignored it come Monday and today as well. Now, they're going to attempt to do some damage control. Kellyanne Conway is dispatched. I guess that's the second line of defense. And here's her attempt to reframe that interaction that you just saw.
The White House has thrown around a number of about 4,000, but U.S. Customs Border Protection says they encountered 6 immigrants with terror ties on the border. I personally think one terrorist is the problem. We know what one terrorist can do when you look at what happened in Paris, a few in each plane on 9/11. But you know what they do? They take that and say, oh, well, you're trying to scare the people, and it's a much smaller threat than you describe. Doesn't that hurt the credibility of the White House when we don't get these basic facts right and someone's not doing their homework in the way they describe it?
This is the 3755 number, does not refer to people at the southern border. Quote, known or suspected terrorists prevented from traveling to or entering the US by DHS in FY17. I believe that includes in some international airports where Customs and Border Patrol says
overwhelmingly at the airport.
But the other 2 statistics on here were about the southern border, so I think it got unfortunately conflated by a colleague. But the apprehensions at the border of gang members, of known criminals, these are all, again, the media has this presentation. If they want to be honest,
well, they're cherry picking, but this is what they do. They do it to Supreme Court nominees if they get something off. I think they do it to all of us. Everyone, like, we all kind of make mistakes. We're talking, all day long.
That was an unfortunate misstatement, and everybody makes mistakes, all of us. The fact is, it's corrected here.
Yeah, so it's, as you're gonna see in future videos, it was not a one-time misstatement. Bear in mind, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is a spokesperson for the White House. She doesn't just go off and do her own research and, she flubbed one stat. She is hand-delivered, probably from Stephen Miller, talking points on the border, and then dispatched to Fox News, a friendly environment to deliver those facts. That was not a misstatement, that was a strategy. And honestly, while Laura Ingraham sort of corrects her, just them having this conversation on Fox News advances the idea that we have to be talking about terrorism at the border a lot. Maybe it's 6, maybe it's 3,500 or whatever, but certainly there are some terrorists there.
Yeah, let's talk about what a misstatement is, because that does happen. I know that we've experienced it. We speak off the cuff on the show. We don't have a teleprompter. And oftentimes when we're in the middle of a point, we can accidentally pronounce someone's name. Recently, I think I meant to say Bernie Sanders and I said Michael Sanders, which is weird. And it was a weird thing that happened that I didn't even realize at that moment because I was trying to make a point. Cenk mentioned that I messed up and I was like, oh, I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders, obviously. That's a misstatement, right? When you're in the middle of making a point off the cuff and you accidentally say something, the wrong word, the wrong name, you get corrected and then you change course immediately. With Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her interview with Chris Wallace, it was not a misstatement because she kept trying to defend the point that she was making. So that's point number one that I wanna make. Secondly, look, the question that Laura Ingraham asked Kellyanne Conway in that clip was a fair question, right? Doesn't this hurt your credibility or the administration's credibility when you mess up the facts like this? But it was hilarious that she asked that question after she herself messed up the facts. So Ingraham said, we only know of 6 terrorists who tried to come into the country. No, but they're not terrorists. They're not terrorists. They are special interest aliens. That is very different from a known terrorist. Special interest aliens are simply people who are traveling or trying to travel into the United States from countries where terrorism exists. It doesn't mean that they themselves are terrorists. It just means, hey, they're terrorists in the country of origin. So let's just take another quick look before allowing them into the country. That is what a special interest alien is, right? And so, no, Laura Ingraham, 6 known terrorists did not try to come into the country.
Yeah, and even, look, you're giving her a little bit of credit for saying doesn't hurt their credibility. I mean, she's obviously hoping that the response from Kellyanne Conway, who is not gonna give a thoughtful answer to that, is no, of course it doesn't. And she had already said at that point, I mean, even if there's one terrorist, which again, there weren't 6 terrorists. We don't even know if there was one terrorist. Well, if there's one, then what? Then we build a wall across thousands of miles of the border. We spend $5 billion. I mean, that's not even the cost. The cost is gonna be as high as $60 billion. So what, if you can identify one death from a terrorist, do you get to spend $60 billion? I mean, I can point out a lot of people who've been killed by the emissions from coal plants. Do we get to shut all those down? Do we build steel bollards around them? What does she think she's saying when she says that?
The disingenuous nature of their arguments is what frustrates me the most, because it's a lie when they claim that they care about the lives of Americans. Because if they genuinely cared about the lives of Americans, they would want to do something about a host of issues that we have here domestically that they refuse to do anything about, right? You think Laura Ingraham wants to do anything about gun violence in the country? No, she'll go out there and she'll demonize the children who have been victimized by gun violence on their own campuses, but she won't do anything about, gun regulation, common sense gun regulation. And we're gonna get to all of that later, but one other point I wanted to make. This government shutdown has led to a record number of TSA agents calling in sick because they have to go work somewhere else to be able to pay their bills. They can't be working for free. TSA agents are not wealthy people, right? And so if you're genuinely concerned about national security, hey, maybe we shouldn't have a government shutdown, a partial government shutdown that actually puts national security in jeopardy.
Yeah, this is a case of shutting down national security to own the libs, basically.
So stupid.
That is what's going on, and that's a great example. There are others, of course. I mean, if you want to talk about a national emergency, he's potentially setting us up for some simply by continuing this unnecessary shutdown because he can't back off of his ridiculous desire to build this wall. So I want to show you, just to follow up on what we were saying about how Kellyanne Conway is implying that this was a one-time mistake. Here is video of the vice president who apparently didn't get that memo.
We're now seeing 60,000 people a month attempt to come into our country illegally on the southern border. With regard to terrorists, we've seen more than 4,000 known or suspected terrorists attempt to come into our country through various means. But on the southern border, last year alone, 3,000 special interest aliens were apprehended.
What we do know is we've stopped, CBP has stopped over 3,000 what we call special interest aliens trying to come into the country on the southern border.
But remember also that we apprehended 17,000 people with criminal records at attempting to come into this country on the southern border last year alone.
Okay, so nothing that you heard there is true. There's not thousands of terrorists, there's not even thousands of suspected terrorists. He's simply making up the numbers. And again, if your spokesperson for the White House and the vice president can't get this right, at what point do you have to retreat from the idea that this is simply people flubbing statistics? It's not. This was an intentional rollout of purposefully false information because they want to manipulate the media into covering it, and they want to manipulate gullible people across America into supporting an insane, unnecessary wall on the southern border. So let's go through some of the actual numbers. I will attempt not to do any misstatements here. So 41 people in the terrorist screening database were encountered at the southern border from October 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018. But 35 of them were US citizens or legal permanent residents, leaving only 6 non-US persons. And let's just repeat it, those 6 people aren't terrorists, by the way, or certainly they have not proved to be terrorists. On the northern border, notice they didn't talk about this. Oddly enough, on the northern border, Customs and Border Protection stopped 91 people listed in the database, including 41 who were not American citizens or residents. So even if after all of this you were still convinced that 1's enough, let alone 6, okay, well, if there's 6 at the southern border, there were 41 at the northern border. You gotta build a whole bunch of walls between here and Vancouver then.
I want conservatives in the country to just for once in their lives be consistent when it comes to policy. So if someone is a suspected terrorist, which by the way, even in this case, these are not suspected terrorists, these are just special interest aliens, and believe it or not, that's a completely different thing. Again, people coming from a country where terrorism takes place, but it doesn't mean that they themselves are terrorists or suspected terrorists. It just means, hey, let's do a little extra screening, right? Okay, you are against them ever coming into the country. You consider them a huge threat. But conservatives will also argue to the death that people on the terrorist watch list, here in the United States should have the right to access firearms. They should have the ability to buy guns. So when it comes to carrying out, whatever NRA agenda there is, who cares if they're a suspected terrorist? Who cares if they're on a suspected terrorist watch list? We'll give them guns. But when it comes to this border debate, special interest alien, we're not, no, this is terrible. We need to spend $5 billion, for the initial construction of this ridiculous border wall, which will do absolutely nothing. You guys, this is nothing more than a political symbol for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He knows it's not gonna do anything regarding immigration. His administration knows it, conservatives know it. The only people who have fallen for this stupid joke are those who voted for him. Those who buy into the propaganda and the fear mongering, those who believe that anecdotal stories regarding immigrants committing crime represents the general immigrant population.
Yeah.
And it's really sad to see how pathetically gullible some Americans can be on this issue.
Yeah, and some is unfortunately like 30% of the country.
Yeah.
Who supported him over and above other Republicans because they believe that immigrants are coming across the border to kill you. And nothing you can say, no facts or statistics or anything is ever gonna convince them otherwise. So much so that it's not like the other Republicans they chose him over they're like happy and fun on the border. Like they're xenophobes, they're nativists, but they really wanted a guy who would get on stage and constantly say immigrants are coming across the border and they're gonna kill you and your family. So I wanna talk about something briefly that we spoke about in the damage report this morning. I got a few more facts on it. Because there are a lot of people who are still, even with all of this, they're gonna be concerned that that border is so long, people could come across it and they could be terrorists. So let's talk about a study, an all-encompassing study of all of the people who crossed the border. The Libertarian Cato Institute said that from 1975 through 2017, 7 people who entered the US illegally from special interest countries, states tied at least loosely to terrorism. So again, briefly, they're not terrorists, they're just from countries that have been labeled as having an affiliation with terrorism. Those 7 people across multiple decades, almost half a century, were convicted of planning attacks on US soil. So you might think, that's really bad then. Well, it is, but none crossed from Mexico. They came from Canada or jumped ship in US ports, and all before special interest countries were classified as such. The plots were foiled and no one was hurt. So, for the entirety of a half a century on the southern border, 7 people came across the border, not the border with Mexico. They tried to do plots, they were foiled, there were no deaths, there were no injuries. And the only known terrorists who crossed illegally from Mexico in all of those decades were 3 ethnic Albanians from Macedonia who came when they were children back in 1984. Their plot was also foiled, and they were not from a special interest country. So I understand that if you're conservative, there's no way you got this far into the video, but please, throw down your fears. They are so epically misplaced on this. There are lots of things to be worried about. People texting while driving, that could kill you. Carbon monoxide, there are things that could kill you.
Inability,
sugar in your diet.
Inability to afford the medication you need to stay alive could kill you.
Exactly. Carbon emissions. You're not gonna be killed from a terrorist coming across the southern border. This is not a hypothetical. We have a half-century case study from which to derive all of this information from.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.